Welcome back to another episode of the Brawn Body Health and Fitness Podcast. Joining me today is Brett Platts. Brett is a strength and conditioning professional in the Texas Rangers organization, and Brett and I are going to be discussing his past injury history and his overall journey and evolution that way. We also touch on force plates and the integration of force plate data into what we do in a strength and conditioning environment, and how he would use what we currently have available from a technology standpoint to help further address some of the past issues that he faced himself. Really great episode, and I really appreciate Brett and highly recommend you check out everything that he's doing. This episode and every episode in season 5 is sponsored by Isophit, my go-to for all things isometric strength training. Enjoy. Brett, welcome to the podcast. I'm super excited to work with you today, buddy. Thanks for being here.
I appreciate you having me on.
For people who might not be familiar with you, or maybe they didn't see that the Texas Rangers won the World Series, not familiar with the organization, would you mind filling them in a little bit about who you are and all the amazing stuff you do?
Yep, absolutely. Brett Platts, S&C within the Texas Rangers organization. Spent this last season in low A and high A of the affiliate ranks. I'll be in double A this year with the Frisco Rough Riders. And then prior to that, had a 1-year experience with the Chicago Cubs down in the Dominican Republic. Fantastic opportunity experience down there. And then before that, it was, a 4-week internship at the University of Iowa before I got, introduced into pro ball.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's awesome. And I feel like from what we've talked about in the past, baseball has kind of always been your thing, if I remember correctly, Brett, right? Like you played baseball in high school, baseball in college, and then you transitioned from, being in college ball to almost like interning in college ball. And then now you're on the pro side of it all.
Yep, no, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, baseball's always been with me. I moved away at like 15 years old to pursue baseball academy out west in Calgary, Alberta. From there, I had the opportunity to go play junior college ball at Southeast Community College in Iowa. And then ultimately, torn ACL and menisci and some injuries, decided to go back home, finish up school here, and then just kind of work within the realm of strength and conditioning because I knew that was my passion. Didn't really know the avenue I wanted to take at the time. I just knew I loved baseball and I loved working with those athletes. I ultimately made the decision to go to Iowa, did an internship there, sent a lot of emails to pro teams, and then the first team that gave me the opportunity was obviously the Cubs.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's awesome. That's interesting to have the background of an ACL tear in baseball. That's not a sport I commonly see for, ACL rehab that way. What was that transition like for you going from, playing college baseball and literally moving for, the opportunity to play higher level high school baseball? How was that transition from you playing to kind of you working on the other side of things?
Yep, absolutely. I mean, on the rehab side of things, you learn a lot about your body. And then looking back, I obviously know what I did to perhaps, create that injury and what I didn't do from a preventative standpoint to build up some tissue and resiliency within my body. So I think being around PTs, being around trainers, and then obviously working with the strength staff, both at high school, and the collegiate level, you learn a lot about the field. And that's kind of where I fell in love with it. And I just feel like I can relate with my athletes, the most. I played baseball. I've been through those really tough injuries. I've been through that rehab process. And frankly, it sucks. There's a lot that goes into it. So I think just having that realization that I can reflect with my players and hopefully, make them better, then, I'm all for it.
Yeah, I completely agree. Completely agree. And I think that's a huge piece. A lot of times we hear about an injury and we talk about the physical side of the injury. Well, this happened, we have to do X, Y, and Z. We often forget the mental side. And that's something that you probably, remember yourself all too well with the ACL, right? Like it really sucks going 9 months or more without playing the sport that you love. And it really sucks more when, you're being told when you can do certain things and you're not in control of that yourself. Whereas pre-injury, you could kind of do whatever you want whenever you want, right? Like, if you were anything like me when I was in high school and college, you kind of maxed bench press like 4 times a week. It's just how we did it. So it's really like a mental challenge that a lot of people don't talk about with injury too. And I think that really helps to separate the good from the great in the world of coaches and rehab professionals, right? Like if you can relate and empathize with the athlete you're working with on that front, they're going to really appreciate it and they tend to respond a lot better.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I remember sitting in bed, post surgery, and it'd be like a month before I could walk, and you couldn't do much. And every slight movement you did, is excruciatingly painful. So there's a lot that goes into the mental side of things. I do believe mental performance is a big part of sports, and I do believe it's growing. But yeah, just like what you said, like having that reflection process with your athletes and understanding what they're going through, and it's going to be tough. But ultimately, that's your job as a human, but also just as a coach in general, is just be there for them, support them.
Definitely. And, having that background in baseball has probably, further prepared you for your current role from a strength and conditioning standpoint, because as you mentioned, you kind of understand and get what it's like.
Yep.
And, when a lot of like general public people I talk with hear baseball, they think of like the pro teams that are flying everywhere and that sort of thing. They don't often think about the double A or triple A team that might spend, 5 or 6 hours on a bus trip, right? Like, but you've been there in high school, you've been there in college, you know what it's like, and you know
Yep.
that like, hey, when they first get up off the bus, they're probably going to be a little tight, and we should probably get them moving and stuff.
Yep. Absolutely.
What was on that little transition in your journey there when you went from, States to Dominican Republic to transition to your role with the Cubs? What was that transition like, and how did you kind of prepare for that role there?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I eventually I got the call to work with the Cubs, obviously, when I was at Iowa, very short stint. And they said I was going to go to the Dominican, and I was at the time I was thrilled for the opportunity, and I still think till this day it was an amazing experience, and I learned a lot. You learn a lot about where players come from. Yes, it's an amazing facility down there. That the entire MLB teams have a really good system down there for the Latin American players. So it's fantastic to see. But just going to the facility every single day and seeing how they eat, how they sleep, how they train, like it's nonstop. I mean, that's all they know is baseball. They're prepping to get to the major leagues. So just to be a part of that and know where everybody comes from, and that's where the work starts for a lot of guys. So it's incredible to see, and it was incredible to be a part of.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. And then you transition from Cubs to the Rangers there. And if I remember correctly, the single A affiliate, was that in the States or was that in Canada?
The States, yep.
Okay, in the States. So what
Yep.
was that transition like back from the Dominican back to the States? And how did you kind of prep and go about, planning and preparing for your first year back with the Rangers?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, once being in the Dominican, I knew, I wanted to keep furthering, my strength and conditioning profession. So I knew I wanted to head stateside and get to the affiliate level. Um, so ultimately, the Rangers gave me an opportunity, and I went to low A in Kinston, North Carolina, for the Down East Wood Ducks, and it was amazing. It was an incredible experience. I was there for about half the year, and then I made the transition to Hickory, North Carolina, with the High A affiliate. And again, just obviously climbing the ranks, but also just enjoying, every aspect of it. A lot of those low A guys ended up moving up to high A. So just, again, being there for them, serving the players, and supporting them. You got to see obviously some new faces, but also some familiar faces. So you can kind of pick up back on that routine that we had built out for them. And I mean, that's the end goal, is like, yeah, you want to move up as a profession, obviously, but also seeing your players move up, like there's no other feeling like that.
There's got to be something empowering about them growing and moving up and you growing and moving up at the same time, kind of like doing it together almost.
Yep, absolutely. It's you're with them every single day. So I mean, you're kind of the guy they bounce ideas off of. They rant to you. They come to you with questions. Like, you're there to serve them. Like that's what the motto is, and that's what we have to do. And it's a very humbling experience to know that you can, provide that kind of support for the players.
Completely agree. Now, from Iowa to the Dominican to Carolina, you've bounced around a little bit. You've been with a few different organizations. What kind of things have you yourself learned from, your travel and your experiences, and how have you kind of reflected back on things?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is just be adaptable. Like, especially in the college setting, you can have the perfect program and it can be implemented to a T for the most part, because when you're getting those guys every single day. But at the affiliate, sometimes you got a skinny hallway with not a lot of weights, and there's not much equipment to get, the work in that you wanted to get in. So a lot of times at the affiliate, it's just, how much stimulus can you give them and how much stimulus do they need? That's really the name of the game. We're prepping them to play a major league season. That's kind of my motto heading into every year is, and it's a case by case basis. Like, how much stimulus does this guy need to go out and perform at his highest level?
Yeah, I love that. I love the point on adaptability because as you kind of alluded to, sometimes things don't always go according to plan, right? Like, you might be on a road game and you might be thinking, oh, this will be great. I've got the perfect plan. And then you
Yep.
get there and to your point, there's no equipment or like hotel gym just has a couple treadmills because apparently treadmills are enough to call a gym in
Yep. Pretty much.
2024. So you kind of have to abandon everything you planned and come up with something on the fly. But
Yep.
as you mentioned as well, you also have to account for, the strain and load that a lot of these guys go through because baseball is probably the longest sports season, right? If spring training kicks off February and March and the season runs until September, October, you're looking at, 9 heavy months in a row of, tough, grueling on the road, a lot of games, a lot of volume. So being able to kind of adjust how intense you make your sessions, but still provide value is super essential.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, my favorite saying is, how much stimulus does this guy need? I think that holds dividends to what they need to ultimately play every single day. I mean, there's guys that play every single day and they'll be lucky if they get an off day. And that's just how it is. That's how they do it in the big leagues. That's how you prep them from low A, double A, and triple A, obviously. So that's what it takes. And again, like sometimes you only got 50-pound dumbbells and you don't have a rack, you don't have a safety bar. You just have to give the stimulus that they need.
Yeah, exactly. And you have to adjust on the fly for that, like we said. And
Yep.
it's interesting because when I think about like the younger athletes, like the middle school, the high school, like the approach is very different. We don't just look to stimulate and cause positive change. It's not as much of a minimum effective dose and more of like what's the highest we can put them through, that
Yep.
they're still getting benefit. So it's interesting how we kind of shift approach, or at least I see a different approach at the professional level versus like the middle school, high school level.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, especially for like college programs and professional organizations, like they want, that teenager that, has maximal strength adaptations. They want somebody that is strong. They want somebody that is powerful. I think when you're looking at that high school level, and if I were to go back and train those guys, it would be, how strong can we get? How much force can we produce? And how much of that can we translate? Because that's ultimately what college programs and professional organizations are looking for. They're looking for mature specimens that can go out and perform and swing it.
Yeah, definitely. Now you mentioned that, you're trying to stimulate and provide a good stimulus for your players. You also mentioned that, hey, to a certain extent, if you even want to get to this level, you have to have the ability to produce force and just, be able to swing it, for lack of a better way to put it. Is there any kind of technology type stuff that you guys or that you have found benefit from using to kind of help measure those things?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, definitely with my time with the Cubs, I was introduced to force plates and ball performance, and that's kind of where everything kicked off. And then obviously at the Rangers, yes, we do use force plates quite heavily, and I use them, pretty much every single day, both on myself, but also, with the players about twice a week. And ultimately, like they're mechanical sensing systems, and they measure ground reaction forces of human movement. That's what they do. There's a lot of metrics that go into that system. um, there's hundreds and hundreds of metrics, and it's just about finding what works best for you and what you can utilize, and ultimately sharing that information with your athlete. Because from that technology, you can track strength adaptations, power adaptations, and then obviously some neuromuscular fatigue along the way.
Yeah.
So it's about creating a longitudinal approach, that you can present to both your players, but also your staff, and showing this data. We all have a subjective eye when it comes to fatigue, but now we have objective data to kind of utilize that to the fullest.
Yeah, I love that. The way I typically explain it to people is, say I break out like a vertical jump mat. That's how high did we go?
Yep.
So, what the outcome was. The force plates is more of how did we get to that point? How did we get there? The underlying mechanism. So it's one of those things. I think it's really like evolving lately and starting to explode and take over. We're seeing it even in the outpatient or, private practice side of things for PT, for strength coaches. And as you mentioned, those reports are like very, very lengthy. I mean, I've seen some 7, 8, 9 pages where it's like, each row is a whole new metric. And I think
Mhm.
that there are a lot of different measurements that people kind of get lost in, kind of like lost in the sauce. But, as far as like generally speaking, is there like one or two like general metrics that you feel like everyone looks at?
Yeah, I feel like there's hundreds and hundreds of metrics. I think like some general metrics that most people would look at is peak power, and that's literally just the maximal power produced, force times velocity. Definitely within the athlete setting, RSI, and that's just the ratio of jump height versus the contraction time. I know concentric impulse is also another metric that guys are using heavily, but there's hundreds and hundreds of metrics, but also what correlates with those metrics. Like it's not just a one metric that, hey, this is what you got. I mean, what about just watching the jump, seeing if the force time graph is even right, but also, what's their counter movement depth? What's their eccentric duration? Like ultimately telling a story of how they reach that metric.
Right, right. Let's break those down a little bit, starting with, the first one of just straight peak power. I mean, I just think about, just seeing the stat today of how 29 out of the 32 NFL teams all used like, a certain brand of force plates that way. And I'd imagine all of them probably looked at peak power for their athletes. Why is peak power so, eye-catching or eye candy for strength and conditioning guys or sports science guys?
Yep, absolutely. I mean, peak power is it's the maximal amount of power that can be produced. So it's obviously a very fancy metric, and a lot of guys want to know what their power output is. So from that, you can obviously track power adaptations along with it. So the translation of force essentially, but also you can utilize that metric and others obviously, but for neuromuscular fatigue, and that's what really holds true the test of time for especially, sports that kind of like baseball where you're playing every single day. Because I think I said peak power is an eye catching metric. That's what most people look at.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And, you have to like understand that having the ability to produce power is specific to whatever demand you're measuring, right? Like, if you're measuring like a vertical counter movement jump, for example, then you're measuring like vertical peak power. That's not going to have, it might, I don't know. I don't think it's going to correlate the best with like rotational power. So if you want to look at like rotational power, you're probably going to have to switch to a more rotationally dominant movement pattern.
Yep.
So I think peak power is great. And I think it's one of those things too, as you mentioned, in today's day and age, it's about horsepower for a lot of different sports, right? Like, not a whole lot of college programs, or at least the college programs I've seen, are seeking out athletes who are underpowered. They
Yep.
want, especially in male dominated sports, they really want guys who can either throw a ball really hard or hit someone really hard in a contact sport like football. Like the power needs to be there.
Yep.
And not to mention, even a lot of these combines, even in baseball, a lot of those combine metrics are power based. So if we have higher levels of power, we're probably going to perform better and get better looks.
Yep. Absolutely. Yeah. I think power is kind of the holding ground for athletic performance. At the end of the day, it starts from the ground up. Even a baseball swing, obviously, it's the transverse plane, it's rotational plane, but it starts from the feet and how much force can you generate off that drive leg for both hitting and pitching. How much of that can you translate either down the mound or within the batter's box and just making our way up to obviously the torso. Um, so I think like that's the vertical power aspect of it, and that's why power holds a true value within athletic performance. I think from the rotational standpoint, there's lots of new technology that's also out there. I mean, Proteus is definitely taking over for the baseball and golf aspect of the rotational point. I think it's a great tool. I've utilized it myself. I think it's fantastic. And obviously, there's other programming aspects that you can use as well, whether it's MedBall or whether it's, a Kaiser machine. So just
Yeah.
kind of having a holistic approach to what power is, where it starts, but also maybe where it finishes.
I love that you brought up the Proteus. We have a podcast episode. It was at least a year ago, maybe 2 years ago at this point, with Will Waterman from Proteus. So if you're interested in learning more about that, I highly recommend you check that out. But that machine is so unique. And I
Yeah.
really like, or I haven't seen it yet, but I'd like the pairing of the Proteus with the force plate. I want
Yeah.
the input and data from the Proteus, but I also want to know what's going on at the ground during that. I think that's a very tough to beat combination from like a science and metric standpoint. But we made the comment before about reports. How about multiple page reports from two different, machines? Like that's going to be a lot of numbers and a lot of data to sort through.
Yep, absolutely. That's kind of the beauty of the sports science realm of things. It's like finding those correlations that you find valuable and how you can influence programming on it. Like, yeah, you could take the Proteus, you could take the force splits, you could also take blast data from in the cages for their bat speed and see how everything matches up together and see if you can get some clean data from it. I mean, that's the exciting part of the field of sports science, which is also a growing field. And ultimately, like strength coaches are going to need to know sports science in 10 plus years, if not already. I do believe strength coaches are all going to need to be sports scientists. Like, yeah, we have a report, we spit it out, we have to display it, but we also have to know what those metrics are and what's influenced those metrics and how to program and create those adaptations.
Yeah, not to mention, you mentioned bat speed or exit velocity on a baseball. On top of that, how about in the weight room, right? Like if we can track like barbell velocity, well,
Yep.
we can track, different speeds of the barbell are going to correlate better to power output. So how does that, how does the force plate data that we get from the ground carry over to what we're seeing from like a barbell velocity speed? Again, we're trying to kind of dive deeper into how we get to where how we get to the outcome we're seeing, for lack of a better way to put it. So mixing all those things together is certainly going to be essential. You also brought up the point a few times there about using peak power to assess fatigue. And I think that's essential for a sport like baseball, where again, such a long season, a lot of different games. And, I think a lot of baseball players that I've worked with in the past kind of have this belief that at some point they're going to get injured. It's not a matter if, it's when, they've been told by, a team doctor or an AT or whatever. It's like, hey, it's not if your shoulder or your elbow goes, it's when. If you just play long enough, it's going to happen from the demands of throwing. But I think with peak power and some of these other metrics, we can maybe catch some of those things before it happens, right? Like if we notice all of a sudden, hey, this guy's peak power is down 25% in a week, maybe that's our sign that we kind of overclocked them a little bit.
Yep. No, absolutely. Neuromuscular fatigue is a real deal, especially within the lower limb, because that's essentially what we're detecting is that peak power and that deficit and that decrease. Everybody will have their different percentage on what's a red flag essentially, but the reality is if you can track that and you notice that decrement of whatever percentage you have that protocol set at, then you can implement things along the way to help them build tissue and stay resilient and still go out and play every single day. And what comes with that is both on the strength and conditioning aspect, but also the communication with the athletic trainers, like the recovery modalities that go into it. I've seen it. I've seen the trainers and strength coaches work very, very well. This is obviously related back to when I was still playing baseball. I've also seen them work very, very poorly. So having that relationship with your trainer, because at the end of the day, we're serving the players and we want them to go out and play every day. We don't want that injury report up. So that constant communication of, hey, this is what we need to do, whether it's a stimulus or take something away or monitor workload. So just that combination of having that conversation with the trainers and the staff of, hey, this is what this guy needs to do. And that's kind of the mission we're going to take with it.
I love that point, and I want to kind of reiterate that for a second. That is something I see commonly amongst all the professional sports teams. I don't
Yep.
care what, league you're in or what team, everyone has a common goal of we are here to support the athlete and we're going to make them the best we can and serve them the best we can.
Yep.
That is so different from what we see in middle school and high school and sometimes even college. A lot of times it's all about winning games or getting that kid to, make it through the weekend college showcase tournament. And, a lot of times we kind of lose sight of that common goal, common ground which is the player, or we come to disagreements over what's best for the player, what's best for the athlete. And it's really, I find the best success comes from a teamwork and collaborative model. And the
Yep.
more heads clash on that side of things, the worse the outcome is. I don't have any like force plate data metrics to support that. However, I guarantee you, if you start to throw 10 different competing stimuli between pitching coach and hitting coach and head coach and AT and PT and strength and conditioning and team doc and all the other people involved, not to mention parents and the athlete themselves, I'd imagine you see a significant drop in performance. I'll go down a little rabbit hole on this. You mentioned about, neuromuscular fatigue. I've started to feel that more myself because I've started to mix in a little bit of like strongman style training to my own training. And I thought I knew fatigue. And then I spent 2 hours doing yoke carries. And I wanted to go home and lay on the couch and just not move the rest of the day. Like, you really get to know fatigue. But that's from a physical sense. Neuromuscular, that's the muscular piece. But what about the neuro side of it? If we throw 10 to 15 different competing stimuli on top of, a kid who's traveling 3, 4, 5 hours for weekend showcase tournament, who's probably got either high school or college classes and homework that he has to deal with, and all these other things on top of it, we can really see how all these other factors would impact performance and create kind of like a downward spiral effect.
Yep, absolutely. I feel like neuromuscular fatigue and the neurology of performance probably isn't talked about enough, at least of what I've seen the past 2 years of kind of diving into how do you train the neurology of performance. The reality is there's not much out there, but it's also a very real factor that goes into overall performance. CNS is obviously very real, and it can get fatigued quickly, depending on the stimulus that's received and also the environment that they're in. Yes, the game of baseball is already very taxing enough, but also the psychological aspect of it as well. I mean, the reality is there's a lot of media. They have family, they have girlfriends, they have wives. There's also other factors that go into it. They're not going to come in every single day and feel 100%. So that's kind of the what I would back to is having that subjective eye of, hey, this guy isn't his best today, and that's okay because we're playing every single day. But noticing that, obviously we have objective data on it, but correlating a plan for what that guy needs that day, the next 3 days, or maybe that week, because everybody's going to be different. If a pitcher just got blown up in the second inning and he's pulled, like, he's not going to be very happy. And some will bounce back rather well, and some will. It might take a little bit. And that's kind of the beauty of being a coach. Like, yeah, we train force output, but there's also a human aspect of it as well. Of, hey, this guy, obviously needs a support system right now because he's going through it.
Yeah, no, I love that point. And it's funny because as you were saying, the human element, it made me think back to, a few months ago, we did a podcast with Hunter Eisenhower on his force system, and he brings up the human force, and he brings it up in like the GPP sense. But as you were talking there, I almost like my mind almost took it 180 and said, actually, I almost wonder if I should like change the definition of that to like, the forces that impact the human outside of the physical, outside of the gym, because all of that is going to make or break what we see from an objective standpoint.
Yep, absolutely. I mean, I did listen to that podcast, and it's fantastic. He did talk about high force and slow force and his force system, and I think there is definitely some value in that. And I think it's just another element of programming of what you do with that guy on that day. If he's feeling it, like, are you going to do a high rate of force development? Probably not, because he's already not going to reach the newtons and the peaks that you want him at. But if you take that opportunity to do, a slow force day and that human element aspect of it, like the crawling and the rolling and the carrying, then that adds value to that guy where you're not just adding stress to already stress the existing system.
Yeah, no, definitely. On the peak PowerPoint again for a minute too, a while ago I was chatting with another baseball guy, and he was saying how he loves the like 30-second or 60-second like quick daily assessment, something objective that you can use to kind of see where the guys are at. And I think peak power is such a great way to get that in every single day. Because if you're going to have a guy jump on the force plates, click his little thing in the app and then jump on and do a max height jump just to see what peak power is that day out of like, again, basic counter movement jump, you can in 10 seconds pick up on any of those little trends in workload and how they're impacting power output and use that as kind of like a metric for the rest of the day. It takes 10 seconds and it's going to allow you to like get that quick objective assessment real quick.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it did take program. Like every time the guys come in the weight room, they're going to jump on the force plates. And the more and more you do it, and the more you've been around the guys, but also the technology, when their jump is not the best. I mean, you can just watch them without watching the force time graph. That jump isn't going to be their best, and they're not going to be happy with it. But taking that information and dictating programming on the spot of what that guy needs, and that takes experience, and that takes knowing what that athlete needs. But again, what it comes back to is, okay, like his peak power is really down. He's feeling it. I could tell just subjectively. Obviously, objectively, it's there, assuming intent was at its fullest. Okay, like let's dial back on this stimulus and let's perhaps do this instead. Just so he can go out and he can play shortstop for that day.
Yeah, no, definitely. Now you mentioned a few other metrics that you commonly see used across like pretty much every sports team. It seems that way. Remind me, what were those two metrics? And for those who aren't familiar with them, what exactly do they mean or what do they tell you?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, RSI mod is a typical one that most guys utilize. It's basically the ratio of jump height and the contraction time. Again, you can use that for fatigue as well. It can be skewed quite easily if you're not looking at what goes into that metric. But assuming you're taking eccentric duration and depth and just overall watching the athlete into account, then yeah, the metric will be pretty good, as long as you have protocols in place to make sure that it's not going to be skewed. Another one, concentric impulse. It's basically just the amount of force and the time that is applied throughout the jump. Those are kind of metrics that most people look at. Again, like peak power, fatigue, RSI, fatigue, but also reactive elasticity in regards to the strength adaptation of it and the power adaptation. And then concentric impulse, like how fast can you get out of the hole? Like how fast can you move concentrically, essentially? Which I think there's something to be said for the game of baseball. Like, if you were to break down, the stretch shortening cycle, like the reality is the baseball player, especially in hitting, like he's eccentrically loading into his drive leg to get ready to gear up and hit, a 90+ mile per hour pitch. He's going to go through that stretch shortening cycle just in a different avenue, essentially. He's loading up. He's going to pause. He's going to create separation. He's going to concentrically swing his barrel through the zone. So I think there's a lot of elements that go into it. And I think these metrics just offer programming insights into how you could perhaps train the quality, of the game of baseball, especially.
I really love that point that you just brought up on the concentric side of things, because a lot of strength coaches and even PTs I talk with really emphasize the eccentrics, right? Like, well, it's, it's about how we put the brakes on. But then you look at sport demands and it's like, a lot of these fast, explosive, power-based sports like baseball are very heavy on the concentric side. So, yes, the eccentric's important. Yes, there's a lot of benefits to it, but we also need to have the ability to assess some of those more concentric type things, because that's what the sport demands. Significantly, like extremely rapid, I forget the exact number right off, extremely rapid contractions of very complex joints and muscle systems working together. And if we don't have the ability to coordinate that, or we have like I call it like an energy leak somewhere in the system, then we're essentially compromising the athlete's ability to perform their best, but also stay healthy.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the translation of force through baseball is concentric. I mean, the reality is you're eccentrically loading and the final output is either a throw or a swing. And that's a concentric, obviously, movement towards whatever direction you're going. With that, though, can you just train concentrically throughout the entire season? I would say no, because eccentric still need stress and you still need stimulus, and you have to stress, obviously tendons and ligaments, and you have to create resiliency within the body. I think the ultimate question is, if eccentric stress causes fatigue, then how much eccentric stress is enough for them to have enough resiliency to go out and play every single day? And I think that's a question that I especially have. Like if I look at a catcher who's constantly in a squatted position after catching bullpens and playing in the game, and they're playing 6 days a week, like they're already getting a lot of eccentric stress for starters. They've done it their entire life. But does that mean I'm gonna, front squat them every single time we're in the weight room? Probably not, because I don't think that's the stress that they need. I think if you were to take, concentric movements, that might benefit them a lot more, depending on what their structure is, and what they need. There might be a guy that needs to learn how to rotate fast and needs to work on overspeed training and the use of concentric work. And again, go back to the neurology of it, is like, can we teach our body to move faster than what it's used to?
Yeah, exactly. And that opens up the door for, the whole concept of overspeed and that sort of thing as well. But ultimately, to your point, it all comes back to the art of coaching, right? Like if you aren't recognizing those things and adjusting for them, then you're ultimately going to be doing your athletes a disservice. Now, none of us know everything. We all make mistakes. I make a mistake at least once per day, most of the time, several times per day. No one's perfect. But, at the same time, we're all trying to be better about what we do. And this is certainly a great way to push that little coaching envelope for yourself of recognizing what the athletes are doing, the positions they're in, the demands that their body is on, seeing what it does to them from an objective physiologic standpoint, and then seeing how you can adjust and modify your training to improve those underlying factors a little bit more.
Yep, absolutely. And it's a case by case basis. Like if guy is heavily force dominant, I'm probably not going to resist him anymore. I'm probably going to assist him into speeds that he's never done before. I don't look at a guy that, can't move that fast, and I'm going to load him up on a safety bar. And also for the plyometric, I'm going to resist him. Like, I don't think that's going to benefit him at all. At all. I think that's just basic programming, but also understanding what your guy needs and having that conversation. Like, how do you feel in the cages? How do you feel when you get in that batter's box? Well, I'm feeling slow. Okay, well, there's things that we can do to, help achieve, making you move faster, essentially, whether it's assisted work, med ball work, over speed training. There's a variety of training aspects that you can do. It's just about getting with that guy and figuring out what he needs best.
Yeah, no, definitely. I completely agree. Along those lines too, at one point you were that guy. You were the one who, tore his ACL and meniscus and had to come back. Knowing what you know now about force plates and, objective testing and data and that sort of thing, is there anything that you would have done for yourself when you were at that, like, magic 9 to 12 month mark, about ready to return to sport? Is there anything that you would have wanted to look at on yourself or run yourself, knowing what you know now?
Yeah, so I think starting with prior to when I tore my ACL, I was very force dependent. I didn't translate a lot of force, aka I didn't have a lot of power output. Yeah, as third base, I could swing it, but I didn't have a lot of translation going on. So I was very force dependent. I was, probably 165 pounds, and I got up to about 190 pounds within like a year and a half. It's a lot of extra weight with on your tendons and your ligaments. There's a lot that goes into that. And with that, knowing what I know now, I didn't do the necessary things to actually prepare my tissues for the demand of my sport. I ultimately tore my ACL, tore my menisci. And I think a large portion of that is I didn't do enough body awareness. I didn't do enough agility. I didn't do enough cuts. And my body was not used to carrying that much load, and cutting and pivoting of what it used to do at 165 pounds. So ultimately, they tore. It was bad. But going through the rehab process, it's important. There's tons and tons of avenues of ACLs and how to rehab them. But also just, I was, 215 pounds. I gained a significant amount of weight. So obviously the cardio aspect was important, but also just prepping my tissue and creating, stronger ligaments through proper strength training. Whatever that might be, that was definitely essential for me as I came out of the ACL process and ultimately completed my rehab, was knowing how to actually strengthen tissue and ligaments throughout my body where I could actually move and perform the sport.
It makes me think back to a recent conversation I had with a surgeon about like just all the different benefits of eccentric loading and,
Yeah.
not just doing that from like an injury prevention standpoint, but if you're unfortunate enough to experience an injury like this, like a lot of times we can start that early for people, especially in the case of the ACL, right? Like I get people in here 16, 18 hours after surgery. Like we start early, and that is the kind of stuff that moves the needle forward from a tissue healing standpoint. Because on top of what you mentioned about the ligament side, if you're getting an ACL reconstruction, I don't care what tendon they're pulling, you're basically inducing tendinopathy. So we
Yeah.
need to get that back stronger, especially if we're looking to return to high level sport. 1 in 3 people doesn't get back from something like that. And there's a lot of people I work with who, they just kind of say, look, this was really debilitating. I don't really want to come back. And that is perfectly okay if that's you. But if you want to get back, we can certainly make it happen.
Yep, absolutely. And I mean, back to what we talked about earlier, like the rehab's tough, especially for ACL. Like it's grueling. Like it hurts, both mentally and physically. There's a lot that goes into it. And just having, that mental side of it as well. That's part of the reason why I switched gears and got in the field of strength and conditioning. Was I I mentally I wasn't there. My jersey was always dirty. I was always diving for balls. And the reality is I didn't feel comfortable enough with diving and cutting and getting that jersey dirty. Whereas like, hey, I had to switch avenues and decide what I want to do. And ultimately the rehab process led me down the field of strength and conditioning.
Yeah, there's beauty in the struggle at the end of the day. It got you
Yeah,
here after all. So,
absolutely.
which is amazing. To your point though about not feeling comfortable diving and, just doing all these different crazy things that you have to do sometimes in baseball, that's not going to show up on force plates. Like I've got force plates sitting out there right now. If I put someone on them 10, 12 months after ACL and, made them jump and do all kinds of crazy things, it's not going to show me whether or not they're comfortable diving.
Yep.
So even though the data is great, you still have to incorporate a sport specific element. And as you mentioned before, you have to incorporate that subjective side because just because things objectively look good doesn't necessarily mean we're ready to go.
Yeah, absolutely. Objective data is great, but that's kind of the art of coaching and rehabbing and knowing what your guy needs, guy or girl. You need to know what subjectively how they're feeling.
Yeah. And again, as you mentioned before, how that correlates to what you see from a testing standpoint. And I know, you and I could probably nerd out about different testing metrics or different force plate numbers and, ratios and all these different things that you could do all day long. But I also know you're a very busy guy, Brett, and you have a lot going on. Is there anything else that you wanted to bring up or, kind of wrap up with as we're discussing today?
No, I think like the biggest thing within, the realm of strength conditioning and especially within pro ball is, be adaptable. Adapt or die is kind of my saying. I mean, that's the reality of it. There's a lot of programming aspects that go into it. There's a lot of sports science technology out there. Depending on your time, budget, and resources, I think the biggest thing for strength coaches is just utilize what you have and understand the objective data, but also subjectively, be there and understand the art of coaching.
Yeah, I love that point. And on the point of resources too, if you have force plates and you can travel with them, that's amazing. By the same token, they cost thousands of dollars and
Yep.
they have a little bit of weight to them. You're not
Oh,
always
they're
going to be
heavy.
able to, yeah, you're not always going to be able to just, pack up, throw them in the carry on and go. Like, there's definitely some consideration to be had there. On the sports science side, if it's me and I have to travel with a team and I can't pack force plates, I'm going with a little hand grip dynamometer. I know it's not perfect, but let me tell you what, it's cheap, it's
Mhm.
convenient, And grip strength in varied positions is some kind of objective thing I can measure a lot easier than like force plate data.
Yep, absolutely. I mean, there's a lot of other resources that are out there, whether it's jump mats or measuring grip. Like there's a lot of cost effective measures that you can get objective data. Might not be perfect, but something is always better than nothing.
Completely agree. And Brett, for people who want to find out more about you or follow along with you, because as we were talking about earlier, you've been on a few other podcasts and different things that way. Where can they find out more about you at?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Instagram and Twitter, but also, my DMs are always open. If you guys want to reach out and message me and talk shop, I'm all for it. Especially for obviously strength coaches, but the younger strength coaches, I'm all for, helping everybody that I can. Because at the end of the day, we're all trying to be better and learn and help each other out along the way.
I believe you own something called Athletic Realm too. Is that correct?
Yes, that was my first business that I started, basically just working, remotely with collegiate and high school athletes to help further, their performance. And then, yeah, just kind of, again, the art of coaching. If I can do it remote, then I feel like I'm still helping, guys out along the way.
Awesome. We'll link to all of that in the description below. So if you didn't quite catch it and you want to keep up with Brett, you can just follow there. Really appreciate your time today, man. Thanks for being here.
Awesome. I appreciate it. Thanks for having me on.